Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Seminary of the Third Age. Welcome. We acknowledge that we are on Kaurna land and that the elders of the Kaurna people have prepared us for this place and prepared a wonderful place so we can come and settle on their land. So we recognise we are on Kaurna land. Tonight, we have the special privilege of having Anne Pattel-Gray. Anne Pattel-Gray is a member of the Bijara people, and she is, well, extraordinary lady. She has a PhD, is the first person to ever get an Aboriginal person to give a PhD in Brisbane University.
No,
Sydney University. She's a leader in the whole area of making us aware of just how significant the land is and the spiritual world connected with the land. We recognise her presence and above all recognise that she is contributing now especially two books at the back. Decolonising the Biblical Narrative. Two of them, Volume 1 and Volume 2, are available in the back. She's my latest mentor. I've learnt so much more about this place, this land, the spiritual, and she is going to give us tonight an understanding of the relevance for us today of First Nations spirituality. Her voice has not been heard until recent years. She was silenced by the church, but now let's hear her voice. Welcome, Anne Pattel-Gray.
It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening and to have this opportunity to share some of my insights, but also some of my research that I've been working on for a number of years. I don't know if you've heard me recently, or ever heard me. It's what I'm going to say tonight is not new in some aspects because I'm quite challenging. And I look at the social political, but more the church's role in our dispossession and critique a theology that supports a colonial perspective. Land to Australia First Nations people is a critical life source for our existence. Land is life-giving, spiritual, physical, social and cultural. Ceremonial, and all of these are the foundation to our identity and connection to land. As a First Nations scholar, theologian, author and activist, I have spent decades on my own journey of discovery to explore the rich religious, cultural and spiritual heritage of my people and to affirm and embrace my people's teachings and epistemology within the development of my own academic research. Aboriginal cosmology, Wulchunchun or worldview, and epistemology are core to a First Nations ontological quest and fundamental to what we know and embrace. The basis of this research is that we are the oldest living culture in the world, and we have a deep understanding of the mysticism associated with the Creator Spirit as this has been nurtured over some 110,000 years. Australia's First Nations people believe we are created in the image of the Creator, and our land was bestowed upon us by the Creator, and we have never seceded our sovereignty. Our spirituality has been nurtured over thousands of years, and as a result, we have a very intimate relationship with the land through our spirit ancestors. And when we speak of this relationship, we invoke the Spirit Creator in our midst. Land is more than just a commodity, as the land has far greater value than money. Aboriginal people view land as spirit, the nexus to our spirit ancestors. The law is carved into the land. The late Galarrwuy Yunupingu, a respected Aboriginal leader, describes land and spirit this way. This spirit that cannot be seen, It is like air. We breathe out of it, we live in it, but we do feel it. We do not touch it. It is there, like I'm standing here, like my ancestors are standing with me. The ancestors of this land are standing with us. That spirit is still strong all the time. Our ancestral narratives reflect this relationship, and our ceremonies give praise to our Creator Spirit and remind us of our obligations to one another, to land, to the environment, and the whole of creation, to our law and to the responsibilities given through our kinship system. Our faith in the spiritual world were and still are the life force and the foundation of our life existence and survival. The land is the source of life for us, and we cannot survive without our connection to the life source, as stated by our spiritual leaders. The Creator Spirit is the creator of our world and the creator of our humanity. We are created in the image of the Creator Spirit, and we are who we are because of the Creator Spirit. We have an intuitive sense of God as the Creator Spirit, as a wisdom teacher on country, and as Spirit. The Creator Spirit bestowed upon us our land and entrusted this world to us, and we are to protect, care for, and to rejuvenate Earth Mother. What the colonisers failed to see was the rich spiritual life in which Aboriginal people lived, and the presence of the Creator Spirit in us. Their understanding of God was different from ours, and because of this, they could not see that we were a deeply spiritual people. The coloniser could not see past our blackness, nor could they comprehend our deep spiritual relationship we had and continue to have with our land that is spiritual in nature, and that our connectedness was defined by the bestowal of land to us by the Creator. When the British Empire invaded our lands in 1788, so began the forced indoctrination of Western Christendom, which would be the beginning of our nightmare. Empire was baptised by Christianity, and Christianity on many occasions served as the running dog of imperialism. The collusion between state and church was such that every aspect of our lives would be literally dominated, and the good news would be instead anything but good. The British invaders were consumed with an imperial delusion of superiority, that they were commissioned by God, king and country to take the lands they deemed to be unutilised. British imperialism saw themselves as God's chosen people, to be agents to take possession of lands that they deemed had not been exploited to its maximum potential, and to deliver the advancement of Western civilization to First Nations people at the fundamental foundation to their mission. Nasi Vatudua details how empires are founded on delusions, idiosyncratic beliefs, doctrines or ideologies invented, maintained or propagated despite being contradicted by reality or reason. Imperial delusions inspired the most violent forms of injustice pertaining to people and land in colonised context, such as being subjugated to dehumanising measures like racism, religious violence, ethnic cleansing, and cultural displacement. Because imperial expansion operated upon the delusion that the people with certain skin colour, beliefs, ethnicity, and culture are inferior and less human. As such, they do not deserve to own land, have access to resources, be free with the right to be self-determining. Aboriginal nations would experience a version of God that was not only foreign but also racist, dehumanising, dominating, and who demanded total submission to the British Empire and the colonists. The Bible was used as a tool to justify all manner of dehumanising actions of the colonisers, and Aboriginal people would quickly see and learn how the colonisers dominated every aspect of the Bible, from biblical interpretation and translation to the point where the text was used to justify racist views, Western syncretism, colonial theft and dispossession, subjugation and oppression, massacres and cultural genocide, and the rape of women and children. This racist biblical view also formed the basis on which we were cursed, deemed pagan and our culture demonic, and a racially inferior race of people. Many First Nations people ask, what can turn the same people who call themselves by Christ's name into a people who will kill, steal, and destroy land and nature with genocidal passion? The colonial invaders based their racist views, believed that their whiteness made them superior, and they considered First Nations people as being inferior and morally bankrupt. It was imperative for the coloniser to dominate and take control over the lives of First Nations people and to force them into submission. This saw the coloniser impose their control through military might and political dictatorship, through the racist attacks on First Nations people's self-image, self-worth, through the destruction of First Nations people's culture, art, dance, sacred sites, religion, history, geography, education, and the outlawing of the use of traditional language and being forced to take on Western culture, behaviours, language, as Western culture was viewed being civilised and Christian. The Bible that came to Australia was also whitewashed, and every person depicted in the Bible as white, and even Jesus was white, blonde hair, blue-eyed and white skin. How could First Nations people ever hope to identify with the Bible when all black peoples were slaves in bondage to the white rulers, and where blackness was viewed as sinfulness, wickedness and evil? This had an enormous impact on the psychological makeup of First Nations people around the globe. This led to the mental abuse of First Nations people suffering at the hands of the colonial structure and system. These days, First Nation people continue to experience racial discrimination, where the federal government suspends the Racial Discrimination Act that protects the human rights of Australia's First Nations people, that sees the continuing removal of our children from their families and community. This includes government taking control of our people's incomes, high incarceration rates of Aboriginal people, children and young people, high suicide rates of our children, and the denial of cultural rights and heritage, and successive governments' failure to formalise a treaty with the First Nations people. The horrific acts that have been inflicted upon Australia First Nations people have had a deep psychological impact on the lives of Aboriginal people, which has left them traumatised, and the effects of this trauma are still being felt today. Other genocidal acts led to the crushing of Aboriginal people's cultural identity, religious and spiritual beliefs. This history of colonisation is seen as the domination of the Western world. Whether this is good or bad, it has impacted upon the physical, emotional and psychological lives of Australia's First Nations people, resulting in intergenerational trauma that means through the means of colonisation and missionisation. So when we look around Australia and we see the brokenness of our people, that's the history of that brokenness. It didn't just happen that we're all drunks and we're broken. There's a whole history of why our people are where they are today. And it's traumatic when you review that history. In defining the methodological process in which is used, this must include the historical experience and current experiences of continuing racism and discrimination and marginalisation, which is the lived reality of Australia First Nations people. The legacy of colonial Christianity and its effects on both First Nations and colonial participants in the colonisation and missionisation processes meant there was and still is a critical need for Aboriginal people to identify and to reaffirm our spirituality and cultural heritage as the first step in our struggle for religious self-determination. This was the first step in the process for Australia's First Nations people to reinterpret the biblical narratives and to colonise our theology and the removal of all Western biases. As an Aboriginal scholar, I have always struggled with the colonial narrative that was presented to us that portrays a colonial God who favours one race over another. Although this is an Israelite narrative, it has been taken over and co-opted by the Western world and used to justify Western colonisers who identify themselves as the chosen ones. I cannot believe that this colonial God is the one and the same as the Creator Spirit that we know and understand and whose spirit we breathe. This colonial imperial God that the colonisers brought to our land was and still is hell-bent on destroying First Nations people. And we could not tolerate bearing this image of this colonial God, nor could we find comfort in or communion with a God who acted like a colonial landlord. Randy Woodley, a Native American Indigenous theologian, describes the Western world as being physically dualistic, morally dualistic, essentially spiritual, religiously intolerant, individualistic, hierarchical, competitive, greed-based, utopian, white supremacist, anthropocentric, triumphalistic, and patriarchal. There isn't few much to for you, was there? This description would be one that Aboriginal people would agree with, as this has been their experience. The Australian Church has taught either directly or by implication that the people in the Bible were white, and that to be white was a good thing because it was to be like God. If this was so, Aboriginal people soon realised that they could never be white, so they were doomed to eternal damnation. Unfortunately, the colonial Christianity transported to our land in a flower pot remains in its original flower pot and was never transplanted into the land of my people and therefore never took root in this country. And this is visible by the fact that theological education still looks to the north and is only engaged in its research and discourse with Europe and North America, where we see in Australia the majority of theologians have very little engagement within the landscape where they actually live, or within the political and theological context, or with First Nations peoples whose land they live upon and call their own. It is important to examine the illegitimate use of power via white supremacy and religious cultural control, especially as used against others structurally, is among the primary failures of Western colonial Christianity. This Western imperial God embodies all that is evil: colonialism, patriarchalism, misogyny, racism, homophobic disdain, which unfortunately permeates the ecclesiology and the theological education today. Therefore, it is important for Aboriginal people to return to the image of the Creator Spirit prevalent in our culture and spirituality as the source to understand our relationship with the Creator Spirit. In order to do so, Aboriginal people must deconstruct, decolonise the Western colonial God brought to us by the colonial church. Since the late 80s, significant cutting-edge theological research began to emerge from African American theologians such as James Cone, Cornell West, Katie Kennan, Mary Shawn Copeland, Jacqueline Grant, Willie James Jennings, and biblical scholars identifying the black people and races in the Bible Scholars such as Charles B. Kofer, Kane Hope Felder, Randall C. Bailey, Jacqueline Grant, and including South Africa, Atumalo Masela. These scholars would have a significant impact on biblical and theological perspectives of First Nations people around the globe. Black people would have, for the first time, a different interpretation of the biblical narratives, and this would bring a whole new dimension and discourse to the table. This would bring a new revelation for Aboriginal theologians, because now the biblical narratives had a totally new dimension with the identification of black people and people of colour in the biblical narratives, brought a new insight to how we read and understood the Old and New Testament. This would be revolutionary for Aboriginal people. This affirmed Aboriginal Christians as it became clear that the Bible wasn't just about white folk. If this is the case, then perhaps there were other areas that we needed to investigate. For example, if the colonisers distorted the identities of people in the Bible, did they also distort the texts? Were they changed to provide justification for colonisation, greed, abhorrent treatment of First Nations peoples? Over the next several decades, First Nations scholars would spend considerable time investigating these areas. In 2019, Professor Norm Hubble and I began discussions. Together we commenced working to decolonise biblical narratives, beginning with Genesis. With the development and exploration of the hermeneutical process that we use, together we held a number of week-long workshops with Aboriginal Christian leaders from across the country to share our work and findings. I wish to take this opportunity to express my deepest gratitude to Norm, as we acknowledge his courage to give us insight into the Hebrew narratives of Genesis and to open this world to us as non-biblical scholars. Norm's incredible willingness to deconstruct and to decolonise the biblical narratives with us has exposed the colonial bondage that has encapsulated the colonisers' interpretation of biblical narratives to legitimate colonisation that is expressed through their theology. Arising out of these workshops came 3 publications, which Norm, of course, shared with you today. There's the 3rd one coming. The 3rd one's even more deadly than these 2. And these are available, I think, here at the back to buy if you wish to. Another Australian biblical scholar, Mark Brett, has made a significant contribution in his publications titled Decolonising God, the Bible in the Tides of Empire. So that's another good one to read as well. It is imperative for Christians to understand that the Bible has been read, translated and interpreted from a colonial's perspective, whether this is from a conscious or a non-conscious awareness, as the Bible has been used by the colonisers, missionaries, as a tool to justify invasion, conquest, theft of lands, massacres, cultural genocide, racism, hatred, prejudice, exclusion, forced assimilation, and the ongoing social and political injustices that Aboriginal people face every day. The history of our country can be summarised as colonial terrorism. Stephen Henricks writes, the Bible has been used as a tool of colonisation, exclusion and cultural genocide. It still is. But this does not have to be. For centuries, communities of radical compassion and courage have read and reread the sacred pages in creative and critical fashions, so that these old memories shape the powers from their thrones and bring actual change to those who have kept them down. The Australian Church practiced racist, heretical biblical exegesis and hermeneutics Aboriginal people's experience of the transcendent were expected to be limited to white Western understanding and viewed only through their cultural lens. Indeed, their expression of God, church, faith and life were forced into being limited to white Australian ones. Most European Christians came to prosper from the new land, but the presence of Indigenous peoples restricted this process. Thus, Aboriginal people were taught falsehoods and heresies to rationalise the theft and takeover of their land. From the very first mission to later, more organised denominations, the Australian Church read out the meaning of the actual text of the Bible in a way that distorted much more than just words. The biblical injunction found in Genesis 1 verse 28 provides an excellent example. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over everything that moves on the earth." Heretical colonial exegesis and hermeneutics turned this passage into a mandate for the conquest, the colonisation of the lands, and the domination, subjugation of the natives. Reinforced by Western racism and pretensions to superiority, they supported the denigration of Aboriginal people. As Harrison states, the Bible played a pivotal role in justification of colonisation in the 17th century England. A number of different texts were used in these discussions, but the command to subdue the earth seems to take a central place in the justification for colonisation. A passage that originally was intended to have humanity propagate the earth was twisted into one justifying theft, enslavement, imprisonment, terrorism, brutality and colonial domination. This belief continued into the 18th and 19th century in countries like Australia. The Australian Church had the benefit of literally thousands of years of analytical study of the biblical texts, complemented more recently by the development of critical tools which would subsequently be refined into textual, historical, grammatical, literary forms, traditions and redaction criticism. And what did the Australian Church do with all of this teaching? It warped it to serve its own self-interest. Another outstanding example found in Australian Church's teaching of the heretical so-called curse of Ham. Aboriginal people were taught by the Church one of the most notorious examples of Western theological deceit across Australia. This Church teaching of the Hermetic curse supposedly condemned all black-skinned people to eternal inferiority based on a very specific kind of interpretation of the story of Genesis 9, verses 18 to 27. Sadly, some missionaries were quite efficient, and a few older Aboriginal people still believe they are condemned by God to be less than white. I was taught this heresy at a Mundingburra Uniting Church in a Sunday school lesson, and I can remember it as if it was yesterday, the shame and humiliation I felt being the only Aboriginal child in this class and wanting to disappear as the other white children looked at me with racist contempt. I recall being extremely traumatised by this experience, and it has stayed with me all these years. I cried to my mother, asking her why God would make us black. Didn't God like us? What had we done to be hated by everyone? I cried to God, asking why he did this to us. I was an innocent child who struggled to understand why God would do this to us Aboriginal people. Very little thought was given by the white Sunday school teacher as to what effect that this biblical interpretation would have on my person. and no compassion was ever given nor demonstrated by her. This experience would define me in so many ways, and it would shape my theological research for the future. Randy Woodley reflects on his people's questions as they wrestle to what truth is and what is lies. He states, white men who translated the Bible probably kept stuff out that they didn't want us to know. And they put things in that they did want us to know that weren't there originally. So in some circles, there is little trust that the scripture is in the best interest of Indigenous peoples. The scriptures were oral before they were written, and we don't have the original oral content of the Aramaic-speaking Jesus. What we have are copies of the oratory in the Greek. I personally am not sure that I buy into the belief that it is sacred because it is written. There is an important and critical need for academic scholars to examine how colonisation holds both white and black Australians in bondage, as we are all indoctrinated to hold a certain colonial worldview that is either conscious or unconscious. We must be aware that the very structures that we participate and function in each and every day are founded on colonial racist values to maintain colonial power, wealth and privilege. And an individual who participates in these structures may not be racist, but the structures itself can be. And we work in these structures that maintain a racist and exclusionary system to benefit the dominant culture. We need to be able to name this if we are ever to be free and liberated from this colonial mindset that holds us in bondage. While this worldview, structure and values remain in place, we, both white and black Australians, will never be liberated or free from a life of division. And Aboriginal people will be forever confined to a life of inequality, subjugation, racism, and perpetual poverty. If ever there was a time to transform our theological education, the time is now. Therefore, we Aboriginal theologians encourage the academic theological institutions to question themselves as to how the church has literally whitewashed biblical narratives, and to examine the racist overtones found in the Western cultural biases and racist exegetical and hermeneutical practices of Western scholars. Where do we begin to develop a theology or a theological truth that names Western racist treatment inflicted upon Aboriginal people in order to deconstruct the racist Western domination and to recognise the Aboriginal people's integrity, strength and resilience to survive? As there is a critical need to eradicate these aspects that hold us in bondage and begin a process to deconstruct and decolonise our Christian beliefs, traditions and theological education, to be able to speak with integrity into the world in which we live. From our perspective, this blatant colonial tradition, which confirms the original harsh mandate to dominate the land and all living creatures of the land in Genesis, also reflects the colonial worldview and the colonial actions of the European peoples who invaded and colonised the land of Australia. Our response is to discern the falsity of biblical traditions, recall the truths of our First Nations relationship with the land and the land beings of our country, and to endorse the alternative interpretation. As a First Nations people, we are not only free to take this stand because of our rich spiritual relationship with the land and the Creator Spirit in the land, because we believe that Christ has liberated us from the sins of colonial control and freed us to correct ancient biblical narratives and retrieve the underlying spirit of the gospel that is colonial free. Today we challenge the colonial inheritors who continue to benefit from the colonial structures, laws and systems as the descendants of the colonisers, who have inherited great power, wealth and privilege, resulting from the barbaric acts of their forebears upon my people, that saw the theft of our lands through legal fiction, massacres of literally thousands of my people, and the multiple generations of stolen children, and the 230 years of oppression and subjugation. As the head of the newly established School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Divinity, we have a very important role to play at this critical time in Australia. To have the opportunity to influence theological education, discourse, and to bring an Aboriginal theological insight, hermeneutics and exegetical process to share an Aboriginal biblical interpretation and to share ancient knowledge and wisdom with you. To provide Aboriginal Christians with access to academic theological education, to raise up the next generation of Australia's First Nations Christian leaders, theologians, biblical scholars, counsellors and church leaders. We are seeking in this place where the gospel brings freedom and spiritual power to follow Jesus with all our hearts, our soul, mind and strength, while still fully embracing our tribal identity, traditional customs and cultural forms, worldviews and rituals. We seek a place where we no longer are seen as the perpetual mission field of the dominant cultural church, but rather a place where we are honestly embraced as co-equal participants in the life, work and community of Christ's followers as Indigenous peoples. The School of Indigenous Studies allows us to be co-equal participants to influence theological education and to share our theological insights, our cutting-edge scholarship and groundbreaking research. The School of Indigenous Studies will be a national platform to raise up the First Nations voice and to also speak into all social and political areas that are of concern and relate to securing justice and equity for our people. Australia's First Nation people are excited about our future, as the School of Indigenous Studies is a major achievement and reflects the commitment of the University of Divinity to take this bold step to provide us the access to influence theological education in Australia. Until now, theological education was seen as the last bastion of white supremacy, and now this has changed for the better. This is a radical change and the pivotal shift that is so desperately needed in this country. The School of Indigenous Studies provides Aboriginal theologians the opportunity to now speak into this world and to challenge the racist biblical interpretations and culturally biased theological concepts that endorsed Western imperialism, colonialism, missionisation in this land. It is important that Aboriginal people move beyond Western imperialism, colonisation, missionisation, and advocate by seeking guidance from our Creator Spirit made known amongst us in Jesus, who is Christ. Aboriginal spiritual leaders ask if 2023 is the year of the Lord's favour to bring good news to the poor and the downtrodden Aboriginal people of this land. And liberation is seen here through the lens of God's covenant with the poor through Jesus Christ, which is seen as unique to biblical traditions. Therefore I state, if we are to have any hope of reconciliation and restoring wholeness in creation, then we First Nations people must first begin by challenging the colonial inheritors as to how do they do theology on stolen land, and what does it mean for them to be seen as colonial inheritors? Because it is time for truth-telling and exposing the lies, the brutality and the power and privilege colonial inheritors have gained at the injustices committed against First Nations people. Hence, it is necessary for Aboriginal people to decolonise themselves, especially to realise that the Bible is still being used by some to colonise us, and we must break free of the colonial shackles in order to be free from the colonial might. It is encouraging to know that Aboriginal people since the 1960s have begun to define their own theology through their cultural lens, drawing on our cosmology, epistemology and ontology to interpret biblical narratives. We want to shape our theological thought and expression by embracing our own language that gives meaning to who we are as a people. Our theology is born from this land, founded on our relationship with the Creator since time began. It is with this deep ancient wisdom that sustains and provides our resilience to survive. In saying that, it is important to note that it is only together can we black and white Australians make a difference as we wrestle with these challenging questions, and to recognise how colonised we are, and to begin the process of decolonising ourselves in the endeavour to liberating our theology from the bondage of colonialism. And I invite you and everyone to look at how you might support the School of Indigenous Studies and our work that we're doing, and how you might also engage with us. Because as we begin to look at how to transform not only ourselves, but each other and this country, can we then forge a relationship that is genuine, that is honest, but one of integrity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to be sure. God is not white then, obviously. Even though all of our artwork is usually portrayed God, and the whole Bible characters is white. Now, questions and responses from anyone here. We've got a microphone over here. Who's first up? Here, right there, that bloke.
That bloke.
And I was interested to hear your understanding and feelings about the religion that has come to you from us, but to recognise within it, from my own experience, that it's not just the Indigenous people who suffer from some of those misunderstandings.
Oh, I agree with you.
And that the points of view that you were putting for Indigenous people are not really exclusive. That there's a whole lot of people that we find out there struggling to understand what is in Scripture. And so I was wondering, can you tell me a bit more about what is the most important aspects of the theology that Indigenous people would get from the teachings of Jesus?
Look, I think the most important thing that we learn from Jesus is Jesus was himself a campaigner, an activist. He criticised the political systems and the religious systems, and that's what led to his crucifixion. The fact that he had the courage to stand and to criticise and hold them accountable. That's the most important thing we can learn, is to be bold and be courageous. The second thing that we learn from Jesus is Jesus was on the periphery. you know, of society, the outcasts. That's where Jesus was, amongst the broken, you know, the sick, the lame, the orphan and the widow. We're not there. Where are we now? We have set up corporate structures to do our mission. We're no longer visible on the margins anymore. We've got the corporate world out there because we're driven by greed to get government money, you know, and they're defining our mission now. We are not defining it today. So we need to be on the margins again with those that are broken and downtrodden, regardless of who they are or their races. They're people that Jesus identified with, you know? And on top of that, one of the other things I think is a table of inclusion, not a table of exclusion. You know, we've got churches defining who has a right to be at the table and who doesn't. You know, what gives us that right? We're to love, and the greatest message is love. That's what we can learn. You know, when we talk, I saw you watching the comments about the Uluru Statement and the referendum. That statement is the greatest love that has been expressed to this nation by First Nations people. The grace in which is extended to this country, still asking for a relationship, asking to be recognised, asking to be heard, asking to have a place. Gosh, you know, when you consider what has happened to them, still they come with the grace, the greatest grace that I've ever seen, and extend the hand to this nation, asking for a relationship. That is Christ. That's the action, and that's what we need to be doing.
Okay.
I just wanted to know where the Institute of Aboriginal Studies is based.
We're based with the University of Divinity in Melbourne, but we also have a base in Queensland, but we work through all of our colleges. So we've got 3 colleges here in Adelaide that are a part of the University of Divinity, and we're more than happy to work with all of our colleges. And we do have some Aboriginal faculty, Bishop Chris on of the Anglican, and then the Uniting Church you've got Dr. Denise Champion. So we'll be working through those. We're needing to raise a lot more money so we can employ a lot more faculty and get a lot more of our next generation of church leaders through. You know, it's so exciting. I've got about 20 young women. Happen to be women ready to go. And I've got about another 20 who are looking at doing the bridging course into academia. So it's quite exciting, the future that we have.
Just incidentally, Anne is in the process of writing her Red Ochre theology.
Yeah.
What will that look like? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Anne. Very much in sympathy. As an outsider looking in, I'm still very much in sympathy. I'm going to say a few things I'm a bit uncomfortable about, not in criticism of what you said.
Please be
open. So, you spoke of mysticism in your spiritual culture, the spirit creator, the faith in spirit realms, the creator spirit. I have a struggle with liberal theology because I, in my own way, in my own context and syntax, agree with all of what you've said in terms of spirituality. And I think we're suffering in our modern intellectual academic circles and general populist circles about the tyranny and misunderstanding of the physical world. It's called a physicalism, which is a metaphysical physicalism to me, that we only accept what is tangible and sensate. But the New Testament and other cultures, and your own indigenous culture is a remarkable example, say otherwise, that we can be fundamentalists in our mindset that the only thing that's worth pursuing, as modern since Bultmann and others have come onto the scene, that the only thing is physicalism because the rest is dualism.
Yeah.
And I think that we ought to, and from my own personal experience I'm speaking somewhat too, that there's no duality, it's all spirit matter together. And what we're missing out on in liberal theology is a lack of understanding and intimacy with a direct experience of spirit. And that's something I hope we can pursue and go beyond liberalism and go truly progressive, to have all the advantages of scholarship over the last 100 years, but also intone the spirit dimension, not as a fable, not as a metaphor, not as a poetry, but as an actual lived experience possible to all of us. So thank you very much. And maybe you could respond or not.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with you totally. And one of the things that Aboriginal people is we view our world holistically. So there's no dualism that exists, you know. The spirit is very much a part of our theology and how we see each other and how we live in this world. I think, you know, I lament for a lot of Western cultures because somewhere along the way, through colonisation around Europe, you lost your connection to country, you know, and that spirit. And somewhere along the way, in losing that connection, it became a commodity to be bought and sold, you know? The value was around how much will I get for it if I sell it, you know what I mean? Rather than the spiritual connection you had to the land, you know? So, you know, over time of colonisation that's taken place around the globe, you've lost that connection. And some of yous are re-finding that connection. Some are going home. I even said to a friend of mine, Andrew Dutney, and he said, you know, I'd love to be able to have that relationship with land, with country, as you Aboriginal people do, you know, to have that spirit and to sit on country and feel the spirits, you know. And I said, well, where do you come from, Andrew? He said, oh, my people, from Scotland. I said, well, you need to go home to Scotland because that's where your ancestors are. That's where you're going to find your spirit. So he ended up it took a few years, but he went back and had a sabbatical there, and he texted me from Scotland saying, hey, now I know what you're talking about. He said, I'm finally understanding. Because all of a sudden, all his ancestors were there. He had, you know, went to this old church, and in the Bible, they had all his ancestors' names written in the Bible, and all of this sort of stuff. So all of a sudden, there was connection happening. And the one thing that we want to do as Aboriginal people is, you know, we have the connection to this land. We understand our land, the creation, and we live holistically. We want to share that with you. We want you to be able to come and sit on country with us and feel what we feel and not see it as commodity, but to feel Mother Earth minister to you and give you life and rejuvenate you, you know, and give you that spirit-filled feeling of wholeness, of belonging. That is something, even the words I can't give you to explain the depth of emotion that you would feel. But it has to be something you experience. And that's what we want you to do. We want you to love this country like we love it. And to see it as a spiritual connection for you to our Creator, to, you know, the divine creator of our world.
Any more?
Thank you. I the topic was the relevance of First Nation spirituality, and I'd just like to understand more about Aboriginal spirituality pre-colonisation. My parents were missionaries in the 1940s up in the Kimberleys, and my father was privileged to be taken by the Aboriginal people to see all the Wandjina paintings and things. So I just want to understand what Wandjinas, I want to understand that spirituality that you had pre-European times, because that was as powerful as what the current one is here, the Christian one. And I just wanted to know more about your own Aboriginals' earlier concepts of spirituality, which were embedded in those Wandjinas. Thanks.
Yeah, look, our spirituality, my theology is born out of my cultural knowledge and what our people give us. And I think that's really important for you to understand that, because in understanding my tradition and my culture, do I begin to understand the Creator and relate then to the Christian message. I mean, one of the most important things, I was just with Stan Grant doing at the Melbourne Writers Festival, and one of the things he stated was, Christianity doesn't belong to you white people. He said it belongs to all people. It is how we express ourselves through our cultural roots and how we define our relationship with the Creator, but also with Christ in our midst. And that was a powerful message, because, when Christianity came here, it came here laden with Western culture, rather than just bringing the message of the good news. For Aboriginal spirituality, our connection to country is first and foremost. When I go home to country, even as I'm getting closer, I can feel my ancestors calling to me as I'm getting closer and closer. So as soon as I get on my country, I have to hop out of the car and I've got to sit on country and just feel Mother Earth and my ancestors just wrapping me and embracing me. I normally go to tears because it's just incredible, the emotion that it provokes in me. And hearing, because as I'm sitting there, I'm hearing the old songs and my old people singing, and welcoming home, and reminding me that I'm never alone, that they walk with me everywhere I go. So when we talk about our law and our creation stories, we talk about the Creator in our midst. We talk about our ancestors and how we came to be and what that looks like and how we understand that and how it, dictates our relationships to not only country, but to each other, but to the Creator, to the spirit world. All of it is intertwined. It's all very holistic. And one of the things I was talking to Norm about today, because we were talking about, the Genesis, how we describe earth or the land being born in Genesis. It's just such a powerful image. This land being born out of the water. And we have creation stories where we talk about where the land is born and brought into being through our ancestors. So those stories and those artworks that you see on caves and in paintings are about specific creation stories. Most of the time they're very superficial, simply because they're sacred, the stories, and they don't share the depth of and the deepness of the knowledge that our old people hold. But what you get is the symbolism of that relationship, of that attachment. To me, to take us away from our land is to kill us spiritually, and which leads to the physical destruction of our humanity. So when we look around and we see a lot of brokenness, you can understand they've been removed. They can't go and sit on country, they can't sing songs, they can't do ceremonies, they can't do all of these things because you've got pastoral land You got, you know, pastoralists have rights, you know, farmers have rights, and we have no access. So the land is very much the soul of who we are, and a part of the essence of our identity. For me, I'm Bidgera, and saying I'm Bidgera conjures to me my land, because that's where I come from, that's where I'm born, and that's where I'll return, and that's where my ancestors are. I don't know if that answered your question, because it's a big one. It's a big one.
And could I just mention, in response to Ruth, that the latest edition of With Love to the World has on it paintings of wandering figures by Kirsty Bergu from Moanjum. And I would like to commend it as one of the editions that I think is going to be rather special.
Oh, it will be, yeah.
Anyone else? Somebody over here? Yeah.
I think your story about one of my mentors, Andrew, answered this question, but you might like to say more, Ariane.
Yeah.
Colonisation holds both white and black in bondage, so how are we liberated?
Well, what it means is that we've all been colonised. We've all been taught to think a certain way. And what we don't realise is we're taught to think a colonial way. That, you know, we had a right to come and take the land. You know what I mean? There's a justification that's behind that colonial mindset. Yeah. And we've found biblical narratives and theology to back it. All right? So when I say that white and black are held in a colonial mindset, and we need to decolonise because we are held to think a certain way, because we've been taught to think a certain way, and that's a colonial way. When you start going through these kind of books, that's when you start realising, oh my gosh, oh, that's not correct. Oh, we were taught to think that way. That's what we hold on to. Do you know what I mean? So all of a sudden you start realising what I'm talking about and what Norm's talking about, how colonised we are. It is a process. It is one that we need to open ourselves to and see that through no fault of our own, we've all been colonised. But it's now, what do we do now that we've been made aware? How do we now proceed forward? Do we move to look at becoming decolonised? And what does that look like? I mean, some people might think that's pretty scary. I find it exciting because as I peel back the layers, I see God, I see Jesus, I see Christ, I see the Trinity. You know what I mean? It becomes more revealed to me as I peel back the layers, because now I'm looking at it through my lenses, through my traditional history and culture. So it's there for you guys to also, there's no one way to interpret the Bible. It'll come through your own personal experience, your own personal culture, and that's what I'm saying. It's open for all of us to discover and explore. But together, how does our discovery unite us, not divide us? How does our discovery recognise each other's humanity? How do I learn from you as you learn from me? You know? And we create a new theological language that is respectful, that is honest, that has integrity. That's the journey we're inviting everybody on, and to me that's exciting.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Got one here.
Oh, one more, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm not sure how this is going to come out, because it's a bit muddled here.
That's all right.
But why the Bible? Why Christianity? Is that what has colonised us, or are we able to connect without Christianity?
Of course we can.
Because, yeah.
Yeah, no, we can connect with our Christianity. Our humanity is what brings us to the table. It's a
Yes, you almost
spirituality.
got there for me in your last answer, but yes.
Well, this is more focused towards theologians and Christians and the church. But for those that don't find a home in the church, it's still open for us to have that conversation. Because,
to
you know,
examine our colonisation.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I wonder about the other dimension.
yeah. I mean, there's many people in this country who were colonised by the Brits, the Irish, the Scots, the Celtics, you know, this goes on and on and on. They live in this country. And, you know, to have these conversations begins to raise questions for them. Probably thought that they never stopped long enough and thought about and say, well, hang on a moment, yeah, okay. Yeah, that happened to my people. What does that mean, you know? For me, how does that shape me? And is there a different language or a different process that I can look at?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
good.
So we're redefining.
Thank you very much. Just to announce that next week, Bob Campy, who is over there, is going to talk about the legacy of the missionaries and bring it into the discussion, into interaction with what you've been talking about. And then the following week, yours truly will be talking about how do we decolonise Genesis 1 to 11, which is one of these books. So the process of reflection on decolonisation will go on for the next 2 weeks. All right? And so, and we congratulate you on becoming the head of the new Department
Yes.
of Indigenous Studies at the University of Divinity. That is a major step forward in Australian history.
Yeah, we didn't have one until last year. How shameful
Only
for
just
us.
happened. And this way it is. And that means that all sorts of, you know, activities and things will happen as a result of that, because that connects up with all sorts of other universities. I mean, seminaries all over the country, you see.
We're also having a conference that was going to be in July, but we're going to push it back because of health reasons. So do look on our website and have a look. We've got Indigenous theologians coming in, and it's going to be a pretty powerful messages and discussions because they're talking from a cultural perspective, which is really fantastic. So I do encourage you, if you are able to come, please come.
Will that be in Melbourne? Will that be in Melbourne?
No, Brisbane.
Brisbane.
Oh, that's the one with Stan Grant and...
Yeah.
Oh, it's been pushed back.
It's going to get pushed back because of my health. I'm not travelling too well, so
I'm sorry to hear that.
yeah.
All right. So yes.
Can I make an announcement more?
Yeah, make an announcement. Yeah, sure. Some more announcements.
Just to commend the History Festival event that's going to be in the Only Uniting Church next week, sponsored by the Only Uluru Statement from the Heart support group. Gerhard really going to tell the story of the recovery of the living language of the Ghana First Nations people from the records of the early German missionary. I think it's an act of penance on his part for the role played to recover the Ghana language. Elijah Bravington, who's the signatory of the Uluru Statement himself, will share his story of the historic quest, that wonderful, gracious request for First Nations to have people to have a voice in the Constitution. And there will be a display of the Ghana footprint, which Iris here, amongst others, have been working on, the Ghana footprint in the municipality of Unley. And there'll be other things too. Dale Ages might also be there. But it's next Sunday, 2 o'clock, 2 to 4, in the Ununiting Church, 187 Unley Road.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you. Let's have a special word and we're going to have some tea and coffee, I think, afterwards. Is it on tonight?
Yes, definitely.
Yes. All right. All together.